Who killed Miss Gray Kelly? It was a beautiful summer evening at the grand estate of Lord and Lady Hamilton, where the 6 guests of honor had gathered for an exclusive dinner party. The sun was setting over the rolling hills, and the soft breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers and the distant sound of a violin playing. The guests were all distinguished members of society, including the renowned scientist, Professor Richard Evans, the wealthy business magnate, Mr. Henry James, the famous actress, Miss Grace Kelly, the young and ambitious lawyer, Mr. David Smith, the charming and witty socialite, Miss Sophia Lawrence, and finally, the trusted and loyal butler, Mr. William. As the night progressed, the guests indulged in exquisite cuisine and engaging conversations. However, as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to change. There was a palpable tension in the air, and the guests began to notice that something was amiss. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence. The guests rushed to the source of the commotion and found Miss Grace Kelly lying on the floor, motionless. She had been stabbed with a sharp object. The guests were horrified, and immediately called for the police. However, they were informed that due to a storm, the roads were blocked and the police would not be able to arrive until the next morning. The guests realized that they were trapped in the mansion with the murderer, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. They agreed to search the mansion for any clues and to work together to solve the mystery. As they searched, they began to uncover secrets and motives. Professor Richard Evans had been conducting controversial experiments and had a history of unethical behavior. Mr. Henry James had financial motives, as he stood to gain a significant amount of money from Miss Kelly's inheritance. Mr. David Smith had a personal vendetta against Miss Kelly, as she had been instrumental in preventing him from winning a high-profile case. Miss Sophie Lawrence had been jealous of Miss Kelly's success and beauty. The butler, Mr. William, had seemed to fade into the background, but he too had a motive. He had been in love with Miss Kelly for years, and had been driven to despair when she had rejected him. As the night wore on, the guests became increasingly paranoid and distrustful of each other. They began to accuse each other of the murder, and the tension in the mansion reached a fever pitch. However, it was Miss Sophia Lawrence who finally cracked the case. She had discovered a hidden diary in Miss Kelly's room, which contained a cryptic message that pointed to the identity of the murderer. Through careful deduction, Miss Lawrence was able to identify the murderer as Mr. David Smith. He had been seen arguing with Miss Kelly earlier that night, and had been found with a bloody knife in his possession. The guests confronted Mr. Smith, and he broke down and confessed to the crime. He had indeed been driven to commit the murder out of spite and anger. After Mr. David Smith was identified as the murderer, the guests of the mansion breathed a collective sigh of relief. However, their peace was short-lived. As the police arrived to arrest Mr. Smith, he suddenly tried to escape. In his panic, he lunged at one of the police officers, grabbing for his gun. The situation quickly escalated, and the officer was forced to use lethal force. The guests of the mansion stood frozen in shock as they witnessed Mr. David Smith's attempt to escape from the police officers. In the scuffle, Mr. Smith managed to grab hold of one of the officer's guns and tried to wrestle it away from him. The officer, a brave and experienced member of the force, tried to subdue Mr. Smith and prevent him from firing the weapon. However, as the struggle continued, Mr. Smith managed to point the gun directly at the officer's head. With no other options, the officer made the difficult decision to use his own firearm. He quickly drew his gun and fired a single shot, hitting Mr. Smith squarely in the head. The guests were stunned at the sudden violence that had erupted in their midst. They watched in horror as Mr. Smith fell to the ground, lifeless. The mansion, once a symbol of grandeur and luxury, was now stained with blood and tragedy. The officer who had fired the fatal shot was visibly shaken. He had never wanted to use his gun. but he had been forced to in order to protect himself and his colleagues. The other police officers quickly took control of the situation and cordoned off the area, but the guests of the mansion remained in a state of shock. As they processed the events that had taken place, the guests of the mansion were left to grapple with the fragility of life and the suddenness of death. They knew that they would never be able to forget the violent end to the night, and that their memories of the grand estate of Lord and Lady Hamilton would forever be tinged with sadness and tragedy. Despite the sorrow that hung over the mansion, the guests knew that they would eventually have to leave and return to their own lives. As they said their goodbyes and departed, each person carried with them the knowledge that sometimes, even in the most idyllic of settings, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface.